There are moments in history when the future arrives quietly, unannounced, sketched in chalk on a schoolroom blackboard by hands barely old enough to understand what they've created. 1922. A small chemistry classroom in Rigby, Idaho. A 14-year-old farm boy approaches his teacher with a drawing that will one day become evidence in the most important patent trial in electronic history. The sketch shows parallel lines, a cathode ray, electrons dancing in formation. It shows television. Not the mechanical spinning discs that others are attempting, but something entirely different. Something that won't exist for another 5 years. Something impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consider for a moment what it means to see the future. Not to predict it, not to hope for it, but to see it clearly enough to draw its precise technical specifications before the materials to build it even exist. Philo Farnsworth possessed this gift. Born in a log cabin in Beaver, Utah, in 1906, he grew up in a world still lit by kerosene lamps, still powered by horses and hand labor. His family moved frequently, chasing better land, better prospects, finally settling on a farm near Rigby when Philo was 12 years old. The farmhouse had electricity. For a boy who had spent his childhood reading by lamplight, this was nothing short of miraculous. While other children saw light bulbs as simple conveniences, Philo saw questions. How did invisible electrons travel through copper wires? How did they know where to go? How did they produce light, heat, motion? He devoured every technical magazine he could find in the attic of that farmhouse, teaching himself mathematics and physics, while his hands worked in potato fields and his mind wandered through electromagnetic theory. It was in those potato fields that the vision came to him. Row after row, perfectly parallel, stretching toward the horizon. His father's plough had created them, one furrow at a time, building an entire field through systematic sequential scanning. And in that simple agricultural pattern, Philo saw how electrons could paint pictures. Imagine standing where he stood, 14 years old, dirt under your fingernails, watching the sun set over Idaho farmland. But in your mind, you're seeing something nobody else can see. You're seeing electrons arranged in rows, sweeping across a screen 30 times per second, each pass adding another line of image information. You're seeing television. Not mechanical television with its spinning discs and limited resolution. Electronic television. Instantaneous. Unlimited in potential. The next morning, he approached his chemistry and physics teacher, Justin Tolman. Tolman was young, only 27, close enough to his student's age to remember the fire of impossible ideas. Philo asked if he could explain something after class. When the other students left, the boy walked to the blackboard and began to draw. What emerged wasn't a simple sketch. It was a complete technical system, the image dissector camera tube that would capture moving images by converting light into streams of electrons, the oscillite receiver that would reverse the process, turning electron beams back into light, the magnetic focusing system, the scanning pattern. Every component precisely imagined, mathematically sound, years ahead of anything being attempted in the world's most sophisticated laboratories. Tolman stared at the blackboard. He understood enough physics to recognize that what this farm boy had drawn wasn't fantasy. It was feasible. Difficult, certainly, requiring materials and precision far beyond anything available in 1922. But the fundamental principles were sound. More than sound, they were elegant. "You're going to do this?" Tolman asked. "I'm going to try," Philo replied. Tolman did something remarkable then. He carefully copied the sketch into his notebook, dated it, had Philo sign it, a teacher's instinct perhaps, a sense that this moment mattered, that this drawing might someday need authentication. That simple act of preservation would, 12 years later, defeat one of the world's most powerful corporations in court. But in 1922, that future was invisible. Philo was simply a boy with an impossible dream and no resources to pursue it. His family struggled financially. College seemed unlikely. The gap between vision and reality stretched before him like an unbridgeable chasm. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop refining the design in his mind. While attending Brigham Young High School in Provo, he sketched variations in his notebooks. He calculated electron velocities, scanning frequencies, voltage requirements. He worked as a shipping clerk, as a janitor, saving every possible dollar, knowing that someday he would need capital that a farm family could never provide. His father died when Philo was 18. The family's financial situation became desperate. College was no longer a possibility, it was an impossibility. But Philo had learned something valuable about himself. He didn't need professors to teach him. He needed laboratory space, equipment, time to experiment. He needed believers with resources. In 1926, he met George Everson, a professional fundraiser working in Salt Lake City. They encountered each other through circumstance, a casual conversation that turned serious when Philo began describing his television system. Everson was skeptical at first. Television was a popular dream in the 1920s, attempted by inventors across the world, none successfully. John Logie Baird in England was transmitting crude images using mechanical spinning discs. Charles Francis Jenkins in America was doing similar work. Both systems were limited, clumsy, evolutionary dead ends. But this 20-year-old wasn't talking about mechanical systems, he was talking about pure electronics. Instantaneous image capture and transmission, no moving parts except electrons themselves. "Can you draw it for me?" Everson asked. Philo drew, not from memory of a childhood sketch, but from years of mental refinement. The design had evolved, simplified, become more elegant. Everson wasn't an engineer, but he recognized clarity of thought when he saw it. This young man wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he wanted to build and why it would work. Everson made a decision that would change technological history. He would raise money for this impossible project. He brought in his partner, Leslie Gorel, a San Francisco banker. Together, they began approaching potential investors with Philo's drawings and calculations. The response was predictable. Laughter, polite dismissals. Television was a fantasy. Everyone knew that. Radio was barely profitable, and it only transmitted sound. Images required exponentially more bandwidth, more complexity, more everything. Even if it were possible, which most engineers doubted, it would take decades and millions of dollars to develop commercially. But Everson persisted. Finally, in 1927, they secured $25,000 from a group of investors willing to gamble on genius. $25,000 worth, roughly $400,000 in today's terms, enough to establish a laboratory, purchase equipment, hire assistants, enough to try. They moved to San Francisco, renting space at 202 Green Street in a modest building far from downtown wealth. Philo was 19 years old, newly married to his sweetheart Elma, who would become his lifelong partner and assistant. He had no engineering degree, no published papers, no credentials beyond the extraordinary clarity of his vision. What he did have was absolute certainty. He knew the system would work. Not hoped, not believed, knew. The physics was sound. The materials were becoming available. Glass tubes could be manufactured to his specifications. Cesium oxide could be deposited on photoelectric surfaces. Electron beams could be focused and deflected magnetically. He assembled his team. His brother-in-law, Cliff Gardner, became his glassblower, creating the custom vacuum tubes the system required. Philo Farnsworth, his younger brother, assisted with construction. Elmer kept detailed laboratory notebooks, documenting every experiment, every modification, every failure and breakthrough. Because there were failures, many failures. Glass tubes that cracked during evacuation, photoelectric surfaces that degraded too quickly, magnetic focusing systems that produced distorted images. Each problem required solution. Each solution revealed new problems. The work was painstaking, expensive, frustrating. Everson and Gorrell grew nervous. Their investors were growing impatient. $25,000 was disappearing into mysterious equipment that produced no results anyone could understand. Where was the television they'd been promised? Philo worked longer hours, slept less, pushed his team harder. He could see the finish line, even if nobody else could. Every problem solved brought them closer. Every improvement in vacuum quality, every refinement in electron beam control, every advance in photoelectric sensitivity moved them toward the moment when electrons would finally paint pictures. The world outside his laboratory was racing too. Vladimir Zworykin at Westinghouse was developing his own electronic television system. John Logie Baird had transmitted images across the Atlantic using mechanical systems. The race was global, competitive, urgent. Whoever solved television first would control a technology that could transform human communication as fundamentally as the printing press. But Philo wasn't thinking about corporate empires or historical importance. He was thinking about electrons flowing in precise patterns, about light converting to electrical signals and back to light, about 30 images per second creating the illusion of motion. He was thinking about making real what he'd seen in potato field furrows 5 years earlier. The laboratory at 202 Green Street hummed with activity. Strange apparatus filled the space vacuum pumps, power supplies, oscilloscopes, mysterious glass tubes glowing with pale blue light. To casual observers it looked like chaos. To Philo, it was a symphony approaching its crescendo. And then, on September 7th, 1927, everything changed. The system was ready for its first complete test. Not a complex image, they would attempt something simple. A straight line painted on glass, positioned before the image dissector camera tube. If the system worked, that line would appear on the receiver screen across the laboratory. Philo powered up the equipment, adjusted the magnetic focus, aligned the electron beam, and looked at the receiver screen. There, glowing faintly in the darkened laboratory, was a straight line. 60 lines of resolution, primitive by later standards, but utterly revolutionary in 1927. Because this line wasn't created by mechanical spinning disks, it was created by pure electronics, by electrons painting an image 30 times per second, by a system with unlimited potential for improvement. The farm boy from Idaho had done what the world's largest corporations hadn't achieved. He had invented electronic television. But this was only the beginning. The real battle against corporate power, against patent theft, against forces determined to erase his contribution from history was about to begin. The straight line on the screen was proof, but proof isn't enough. A single vertical line, 60 lines of resolution, demonstrated that electrons could paint images, but television needed to transmit complex moving pictures, faces, landscapes, action. The distance between a glowing line and a functional television system was vast, filled with technical challenges that would consume the next 3 years of relentless work. Consider what Philo was attempting. Every second, his system needed to capture an image, convert it into electrical signals, transmit those signals, then reconstruct the image with perfect synchronization, 30 times per second. Any timing error, any signal degradation, any loss of synchronization would produce chaos on the screen. The mechanical precision required was extraordinary, but mechanical parts weren't the solution. Spinning discs, rotating mirrors, any physical movement introduced limitations that couldn't be overcome. Electrons move at nearly the speed of light. They can change direction instantaneously. They can be focused, deflected, accelerated with electromagnetic fields. They never wear out, never need lubrication, never break from fatigue. If television was going to work, truly work, it had to be all electronic. But Philo wasn't alone in this realization. In Pittsburgh, Vladimir Zworykin was pursuing similar dreams at Westinghouse. Zworykin was older, formally educated, backed by corporate resources. He'd immigrated from Russia after the revolution, bringing with him knowledge from the Imperial Institute of Technology and experience from his teacher, Boris Rosing, who had experimented with cathode ray tubes for image transmission. In 1923, Zworykin had demonstrated his iconoscope camera tube to Westinghouse executives. The image quality was poor, dark, murky, barely recognizable. The company was unimpressed, telling him to work on something more practical. But Zworykin persisted, improving his design incrementally, achieving 40 lines of resolution by 1928. 40 lines versus Philo's 60 might seem insignificant, but the difference in approach was profound. Zworykin's iconoscope used a storage principle, accumulating electrical charge on a photoelectric screen, then scanning that screen with an electron beam. It was clever, efficient, but the images were dim and required intense illumination of the subject. Philo's image dissector worked differently, converting light directly into electron streams without storage. The images were brighter, clearer, but required more sensitive photoelectric materials. Two approaches, two inventors, racing toward the same goal. But Philo had advantages Zworykin lacked. Youth, perhaps, certainly audacity, and something else, an intuitive understanding of how to make electrons behave. He hadn't learned television from textbooks because no textbooks existed. He'd invented it from first principles, which meant he understood every component at a fundamental level. The laboratory on Green Street became a factory of innovation. Every day brought new challenges, new solutions. The image dissector tubes required perfect vacuum. Any trace of air molecules interfered with electron flow. Cliff Gardner, Philo's glass-blowing brother-in-law, developed techniques for creating tubes with minimal internal contamination. They experimented with different getter materials, substances that absorbed residual gases after the tube was sealed. The photoelectric cathode presented another challenge. Different materials responded to different light wavelengths with varying efficiency. Potassium hydride worked but degraded quickly. Cesium oxide lasted longer, but required precise manufacturing techniques. Each cathode had to be evaporated onto the glass surface in vacuum, its thickness controlled to within microscopic tolerances. Then there was the receiver, the oscillite tube that converted electron beams back into visible light. This required phosphor screens that glowed when struck by electrons, maintaining brightness without burning out. Different phosphors produced different colors, different persistence times. Blue phosphors were bright but faded too quickly. Green phosphors lasted longer but were dimmer. Finding the right balance required hundreds of experiments, and synchronization perhaps the most crucial challenge. The camera tube scanned the image in horizontal lines, top to bottom, 30 times per second. The receiver tube had to scan in exactly the same pattern at exactly the same speed. Any deviation produced rolling, tearing, or complete chaos on the screen. Philo developed synchronization circuits that locked both tubes to the same timing pulses with remarkable precision. By 1928, the system could transmit simple geometric shapes, triangles, circles, crosses, static images, but recognizable. The investors grew more confident. George Everson brought potential backers to see demonstrations. Some were impressed, others remained skeptical. Where was the market for television? Who would buy such a device? What would they watch? These were legitimate questions. Radio had taken decades to find its commercial model. Television would be even more complex, more expensive, requiring not just receivers but entire production, infrastructure, cameras, studios, transmission equipment, programming content. The path from laboratory curiosity to commercial product was unclear, but Philo wasn't thinking about business models. He was thinking about resolution. 60 lines wasn't enough for clear facial features. He needed more, much more. Each additional line required proportionally more bandwidth, more electron beam precision, more photoelectric sensitivity. But the mathematics said it was possible. Double the lines, double the detail. By 1929, his system achieved 120 lines. Images were sharper now, recognizable. He transmitted motion for the first time, Elma placing her hands in front of the camera, opening and closing her fingers. On the receiver screen, her hands moved in real time. It was crude, flickering, but unmistakably television. Moving pictures transmitted instantaneously through space by electrons alone. The world was beginning to notice. John Logie Baird in Scotland had transmitted images across the Atlantic, using mechanical systems, generating international headlines. Charles Francis Jenkins was demonstrating mechanical television in Washington, but both systems were limited to approximately 30 lines of resolution, producing images so crude they were barely useful. More importantly, their mechanical approach had no path forward. Spinning discs could only spin so fast. Physical limitations were absolute. Philo knew electronic television would eventually surpass mechanical systems so completely that the comparison would seem absurd, but eventually wasn't soon enough. He needed to demonstrate superiority now, convince investors that electronic television was worth continued funding, attract the attention needed to secure manufacturing partnerships. In 1930, he achieved 300 lines of resolution. 300. Images sharp enough to see facial expressions, read text, distinguish fine details. This was television that could actually compete with motion pictures for visual quality. Mechanical systems would never reach this resolution. The physics simply didn't allow it. But 300 lines required phenomenal precision. The electron beam had to scan 300 horizontal lines in 1/30th of a second, then return to the top and repeat. That meant each line scan lasted 1/90,000th of a second. The beam deflection circuitry had to change direction 90,000 times per second with perfect accuracy. Any wobble, any timing error, any magnetic interference produced visible distortions. Philo developed feedback systems that automatically corrected beam position. He designed power supplies with exceptional stability. Voltage fluctuations of even 1% produced noticeable image problems. He shielded sensitive components from external magnetic fields. Every component in the system had to operate at the limits of available technology. The work was exhausting. 16-hour days were normal. 18-hour days were common. Sleep became a luxury reserved for moments when his eyes could no longer focus on oscilloscope traces. Elma worried about his health, but she understood. They were so close now, so close to creating something that would change everything. On August 26, 1930, Philo arranged a demonstration for his increasingly anxious investors. They had poured $25,000 into this venture with little tangible return. They needed reassurance that their money wasn't simply vanishing into mysterious equipment and endless promises. Philo decided to send them a message, a literal message, transmitted through his television system. He carefully painted a $sign on a glass slide, positioned it before the image dissector camera, and powered up the system. On the receiver screen across the laboratory, the $sign appeared, clear, sharp, unmistakable. The investors laughed with delight. Here was their farm boy inventor, demonstrating not just technical capability, but a sense of humor about the commercial pressures they all faced. The dollar sign promised dividends, profits, eventual return on their risky investment, but behind the humor lay serious intent. Philo knew that technical demonstrations weren't enough. He needed patents, comprehensive patents covering every aspect of his electronic television system, patents that would stand up in court when the inevitable challenges came. Because challenges would come, television represented too much potential wealth for corporations to ignore. RCA, Westinghouse, General Electric. These giants of electronics were watching developments carefully. They had research budgets that dwarfed Philo's entire funding. They had armies of engineers, lawyers, manufacturing facilities. They had political connections and media influence. What they didn't have yet was a working all-electronic television system superior to mechanical alternatives. Philo had that, and he had something else: documentation. Every experiment was recorded in laboratory notebooks. Every modification was dated and signed. Every improvement was photographed. When patent applications were filed, they would include overwhelming evidence of independent invention. His patent attorney, Donald Lippincott, began preparing applications in 1927. The fundamental image dissector patent was filed in January 1927, 7 months before the first successful transmission. Additional patents followed covering the receiver tube, synchronization circuits, power supply designs, magnetic focusing systems. Each patent application ran hundreds of pages, filled with detailed drawings, mathematical calculations, comprehensive descriptions of operation. By 1930, Philo had filed over 24 patent applications. The patent office was slow. Examination could take years, but eventually patents would issue, and when they did, anyone manufacturing electronic television in America would need Philo Farnsworth permission. This was the theory. Anyway, the reality would prove far more complicated. In April 1930, Philo received an unexpected visitor. David Sarnoff, president of RCA, wanted to see his television system. Sarnoff was a legend in electronics, the man who had recognized radio's commercial potential, built NBC into America's dominant broadcasting network, transformed RCA from a patent-holding company into an electronics powerhouse. He was ruthless, brilliant, politically connected. He understood power. Philo prepared carefully for the demonstration. Everything had to work perfectly. Sarnoff arrived with an entourage of engineers and executives, men accustomed to viewing inventors as employees or obstacles, nothing in between. They toured the laboratory, examined the equipment, watched demonstrations of 300-line television images. Sarnoff was impressed. More than impressed, he was hungry. Television would be enormous, bigger than radio, and RCA intended to control it completely, just as they dominated radio. He made Philo an offer, $100,000 for his patents and company. $100,000, 4 times what the investors had risked. Enough money to retire comfortably, to pursue other interests, to escape the exhausting race for television supremacy. But there was a condition. RCA wanted complete ownership. All patents, all future improvements, all rights to manufacture and license television equipment. Philo would become an employee, well paid certainly, but an employee nonetheless. He refused. The answer stunned Sarnoff's entourage. Nobody refused David Sarnoff. RCA was offering financial security, corporate resources, guaranteed success. Why would a 23-year-old inventor turn down such an offer? Because Philo understood what accepting would mean. He would become a footnote in RCA's story of television development. His contributions would be absorbed into corporate history, his name forgotten, his vision claimed by others. He hadn't spent years in laboratories, survived endless technical challenges, mortgaged his entire future on this invention to hand it over to someone else's empire. Sarnoff left Green Street that day, having learned two important things. First, electronic television was real, practical, superior to mechanical alternatives. Second, Philo Farnsworth wouldn't surrender easily. This would require different tactics. Within weeks, Vladimir Zworykin received new instructions. Visit Farnsworth's laboratory. Learn everything possible. RCA needed to know exactly how his system worked, what patents he held, what advantages he possessed. They needed to determine whether they could design around his patents or whether they would be forced to negotiate. Zworykin arrived in June, presenting himself as a fellow inventor interested in technical exchange. Philo, innocent of corporate politics, welcomed him warmly. Here was another scientist pursuing the same dream. They could learn from each other, share insights, advance the entire field together. For 3 days, Zworykin toured the laboratory. He examined every component. He photographed equipment from multiple angles. He asked detailed questions about photoelectric materials, electron beam focusing, synchronization techniques. He praised Philo's genius, expressed admiration for his achievements, suggested collaborative possibilities. Philo showed him everything: the image dissector's internal construction, the receiver tube design, the circuit diagrams, the experimental techniques that had taken years to develop. He was proud of his work and eager to discuss it with someone who understood the technical challenges. When Zworykin returned to RCA, he carried detailed information about every aspect of Farnsworth's television system. His report to Sarnoff was clear. Farnsworth's design was brilliant, years ahead of anything RCA possessed. Attempting to design around his patents would be difficult, perhaps impossible. If RCA wanted to dominate television, they had two choices: buy Farnsworth's patents or invalidate them. Since Farnsworth had refused to sell, only one option remained. RCA would have to prove that he hadn't actually invented electronic television, that someone else, preferably Vladimir Zworykin, had invented it first, that Farnsworth's patents were invalid because they claimed rights to inventions that belonged to others. In September 1930, RCA filed interference proceedings with the Patent Office. They claimed that Zworykin had invented the image dissector in 1923, 4 years before Farnsworth's first transmission. They claimed priority based on Zworykin's patent applications and his work at Westinghouse. The battle had begun, not in the marketplace, not in laboratories, but in courtrooms. The question of who invented television would be decided not by technical superiority, but by legal documentation, dated evidence, witness testimony. Everything would depend on proof-dated drawings, laboratory notebooks, signed statements from people who had seen the work in progress. Everything would depend on what a high school chemistry teacher had preserved in his notebook 8 years earlier. There is a particular kind of warfare that corporations wage against inventors, a slow siege conducted through legal filings and strategic delays, patent challenges, and procedural maneuvers. It requires no weapons beyond lawyers and patience. The goal isn't necessarily to win outright, though that would be ideal, but to exhaust the opponent's resources, to make fighting so expensive and time-consuming that surrender becomes the rational choice. RCA understood this warfare intimately. They had refined it through decades of patent battles, accumulated thousands of patents covering every aspect of radio technology, built legal departments larger than most companies' entire workforce. When they filed interference proceedings against Philo Farnsworth in September 1930, they were deploying a machine designed to crush independent inventors through sheer weight of process. The interference hearing would determine who had priority, who had invented the image dissector first. If RCA could prove that Zworykin had invented it before Farnsworth, or that Farnsworth had derived his ideas from prior art, then Philo's fundamental patents would be invalidated. Everything he'd built would belong to the public domain, free for RCA to manufacture without paying royalties. Philo's patent attorney, Donald Lippincott, understood the danger. RCA wouldn't be satisfied with a single hearing. They would appeal unfavorable decisions, file additional interferences on other patents, challenge every claim through every available mechanism. The process could consume years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, but Philo had no choice except to fight. Without his patents, he had nothing. No leverage for manufacturing partnerships, no ability to license his inventions, no foundation for a commercial enterprise. His patents were his only assets, worth millions potentially, but only if they could be defended. The legal battle began with depositions. RCA's lawyers questioned Philo extensively about his invention timeline. When had he first conceived the image dissector? Where was he living? Who had seen his drawings? What materials had he read? Every answer would be scrutinized, compared against documentary evidence, tested for consistency with later testimony. Philo testified calmly. Precisely. He described the potato field revelation in 1922, the sketch on Justin Tolman's blackboard, the years of self-education through technical magazines, the move to San Francisco in 1926, the first transmission in September 1927. Every date was certain, every detail clear. RCA's lawyers were skeptical. A 14-year-old farm boy had conceived a fully functional television system in 1922, without formal training, without access to laboratories, without knowledge of the latest research. They implied fabrication, convenient backdating of memories to establish priority. But Philo had documentation, laboratory notebooks beginning in 1926, recording every experiment chronologically, photographs of equipment with dated timestamps, letters to investors describing technical progress, signed statements from assistants confirming the timeline. His patent applications, filed in January 1927, contained detailed drawings that matched his constructed equipment exactly. Still, RCA pressed. The 1922 conception date was crucial. If Philo had actually invented the image dissector in 1922, that predated all of Zworykin's work. But where was the proof? Memories weren't enough. Dated documentation was required. Lippincott knew they needed Justin Tolman, the high school teacher who had copied Philo's blackboard sketch into his notebook in 1922, but 8 years had passed. Would Tolman still have that notebook? Would he even remember the incident? They found him teaching in Salt Lake City. When contacted, Tolman remembered immediately. Of course he remembered. A 14-year-old student explaining a complete television system with mathematical precision? That wasn't something a teacher forgot. And yes, he still had the notebook. He kept all his teaching notebooks, filed chronologically in his home office. He retrieved it, a worn composition book from 1921 through 1923. Turned to the correct page. There was the sketch, dated April 19, 1922, signed Philo T. Farnsworth, the image dissector in complete technical detail, the scanning pattern, the magnetic focusing, the photoelectric cathode, everything that Philo would later build in his San Francisco laboratory, conceived 5 years before construction began. This was devastating evidence for RCA. Dated, authenticated, preserved by an independent third party with no financial interest in the outcome. Tolman's testimony would establish beyond doubt that Philo had independently invented electronic television years before Zworykin's 1923 demonstration at Westinghouse. But the hearing was still months away. RCA had time to pursue other strategies. They began hiring Philo's employees, engineers who understood his designs intimately, who had worked on proprietary developments, who knew the solutions to technical problems that had required years to solve. RCA offered them triple their current salaries, better facilities, corporate security, one by one. Key personnel departed for positions at RCA's Camden, New Jersey headquarters. Philo couldn't compete financially. His investors had limited resources, already stretched thin by legal fees and laboratory expenses. He couldn't match RCA's salaries without abandoning development work entirely. Each departing engineer took irreplaceable knowledge, forcing remaining staff to reconstruct solutions from incomplete documentation. The strategy was elegant in its ruthlessness. RCA gained technical intelligence while simultaneously weakening their opponent's capability to innovate. And it was perfectly legal. Employment at will meant engineers could leave whenever better opportunities appeared. Corporate raiding was standard practice in American business. Philo worked longer hours to compensate for reduced staff. He took on tasks that engineers had previously handled: circuit design, vacuum tube testing, equipment calibration. Elmer assumed additional responsibilities, managing laboratory operations while maintaining detailed records needed for patent applications and legal proceedings. The strain was enormous. Building a revolutionary technology was hard enough without simultaneously fighting legal battles and corporate sabotage. But Philo persisted. He had glimpsed the future in potato field furrows 10 years earlier. He had spent his entire adult life making that vision real. He wouldn't surrender now, regardless of the cost. RCA deployed another tactic. They announced plans to demonstrate television at the 1939 New York World's Fair. David Sarnoff proclaimed that RCA had perfected electronic television, would soon begin commercial production, would transform American entertainment through this revolutionary invention. Press coverage was extensive, portraying RCA as television's visionary creator. The announcements were strategic. RCA wanted to establish themselves in public consciousness as television's inventor before patent disputes were resolved. If consumers believed RCA had created television, then later legal outcomes would seem like technical details rather than fundamental questions of credit. Philo had no comparable publicity machinery. His small company couldn't afford advertising campaigns or press agents. His demonstrations were limited to potential investors and technical audiences. The general public had never heard of Philo Farnsworth and had no idea that a farm boy from Idaho had invented the technology that RCA was claiming as their own. But corporate image campaigns couldn't change documented facts. The patent interference hearing would examine evidence, not publicity, and Philo's evidence was overwhelming. In March 1934, the hearing finally convened. RCA's lawyers arrived with boxes of depositions, technical drawings, patent applications. They argued that Zworykin had demonstrated electronic television in 1923 at Westinghouse, that his patent applications predated Farnsworth's work, that the fundamental principles of the image dissector were derived from prior art available to anyone studying cathode ray tubes. Philo's attorney presented the 1922 sketch from Justin Tolman's notebook. Tolman testified about the remarkable student who had drawn a complete television system on his blackboard. Other witnesses confirmed Philo's timeline: family members who had heard him discussing television as a teenager, investors who had seen early demonstrations, assistants who had worked on the first transmissions. RCA challenged the sketch's authenticity. Could the date be verified? Could the ink be tested to confirm it was from 1922 rather than recently added? They demanded forensic analysis, handwriting authentication, chemical testing of paper and ink. Every test confirmed the sketch's authenticity. The paper was consistent with composition notebooks sold in 1922. The ink matched formulations used in that period. Tolman's handwriting was consistent throughout the notebook, with no evidence of later additions. The signature was unmistakably Philo's teenage writing, matching known samples from that year. RCA's lawyers shifted tactics. They argued that conceiving an invention wasn't the same as reducing it to practice. The sketch was merely an idea, untested and speculative. Zworykin had actually built working television equipment in 1923, 4 years before Farnsworth's first transmission. Surely practical demonstration should take precedence over theoretical speculation. But this argument had a fatal flaw. Zworykin's 1923 demonstration had been mechanical, using rotating discs. His electronic iconoscope wasn't developed until 1929, 2 years after Farnsworth's first all-electronic transmission. The patent applications RCA was citing, as evidence of priority, had been filed after Farnsworth's applications and described fundamentally different approaches. The hearing stretched across months. Testimony filled thousands of pages. Technical experts analyzed circuit designs, comparing Farnsworth's image dissector with Zworykin's iconoscope, identifying similarities and differences. Patent law specialists debated priority rules, derivation standards, reduction to practice requirements. Through it all, one fact remained inescapable. Philo Farnsworth had conceived electronic television in 1922, drawn complete technical specifications, and successfully built a working system in 1927. Everything was documented, dated, authenticated by independent witnesses. RCA had no comparable evidence for earlier dates, but admitting defeat wasn't in RCA's corporate nature. They filed additional interferences on other Farnsworth patents, challenging his receiver tube design, his synchronization circuits, his power supply innovations. Each interference meant additional hearings, more legal fees, further delays before any patents would issue. The strategy was working from RCA's perspective. Philo's investors were losing patience. Years of legal battles with no revenue, no manufacturing partnerships, no path to profitability. They had risked $25,000 expecting returns within a few years. Instead, they were funding endless litigation while watching their investment evaporate. Some investors wanted to accept RCA's settlement, offers limited licensing arrangements that would provide modest royalties without acknowledging Philo's fundamental contributions. But Philo refused. Settling would mean surrendering his patent's full value, accepting pennies for inventions worth millions. More importantly, it would mean letting RCA write television's history, erasing his contribution from public memory. He convinced his investors to continue fighting. The evidence was overwhelming. The patent office would eventually recognize his priority. When his patents issued, RCA would have no choice but to negotiate from weakness rather than strength. The settlement then would be measured in millions, not thousands. But waiting was agonizing. Every month meant more legal bills, more financial pressure, more risk that the company would collapse before vindication arrived. Philo pushed his technical work forward despite limited resources, developing improvements that would strengthen his patent portfolio and demonstrate continued innovation. He developed the electron multiplier, a device that amplified weak electron streams through cascade emission, making his image dissector far more sensitive to low light conditions. This innovation would eventually revolutionize scientific instruments, enabling everything from photomultiplier tubes to mass spectrometers. But in 1934, it was simply another patent application to defend against RCA's interference filings. He designed improved receiver tubes with longer-lasting phosphor screens, better focusing systems, and higher brightness. He experimented with color television, recognizing that eventually black and white images wouldn't satisfy viewers accustomed to colorful motion pictures. He filed dozens of additional patents, each one carefully documented, each one potentially valuable if his fundamental patents survived legal challenge. The work was therapeutic. In the laboratory, problems had solutions. Technical challenges yielded to systematic investigation. Progress was measurable, real, satisfying. Unlike the legal battles, where outcomes depended on judges' interpretations and procedural technicalities, engineering was rational and predictable. But even in the laboratory, RCA's presence was felt. His departed engineers were now working at RCA Camden, developing television systems that suspiciously resembled his designs. Patents that RCA was filing bore remarkable similarities to improvements he had documented years earlier. Corporate espionage was impossible to prove, but the pattern was clear. Zworykin's 3-day visit in 1930 now appeared in its true light. Not a courtesy call between fellow inventors, but industrial espionage at the highest level. Every photograph he had taken, every question he had asked, every circuit diagram he had examined was now informing RCA's development work. The openness that Philo had shown, sharing his techniques freely, discussing his approaches candidly, had given RCA blueprints for their own television system. It was a painful lesson about corporate ethics, or rather, the lack thereof. RCA viewed patents as weapons in competitive warfare, inventors as obstacles to be overcome, intellectual property as something to be acquired by whatever means necessary. Principles like fair dealing, honest competition, respect for innovation, these were luxuries that corporations abandoned when billions of dollars were at stake. Yet Philo couldn't entirely blame them. RCA had built an empire on radio patents, had invested millions in research and development, had created broadcasting infrastructure that served millions. They had earned their dominant position through genuine innovation and business acumen. Television represented an existential threat to their control. A farm boy with superior patents could force them to pay royalties, to acknowledge a competitor's primacy, to accept that independent inventors could still triumph over corporate research departments. Of course they would fight. Of course they would use every available legal tactic. Of course they would try to wear him down through attrition. This was simply business at its most ruthless. But business calculations hadn't accounted for one thing. Philo Farnsworth wasn't motivated primarily by money. He wanted recognition, certainly. He wanted fair compensation for his inventions. But more than anything, he wanted his television system to succeed, to reach millions of homes, to transform human communication the way he had envisioned in those potato fields. If partnering with RCA would accomplish that, he was willing to negotiate. But surrendering his patents entirely, allowing his contribution to be erased from history, accepting roles as a footnote in someone else's story that he could never accept. So, the battle continued. Legal briefs accumulated in filing cabinets, depositions filled storage boxes, expert witnesses prepared technical analyses, and in Washington, patent office officials slowly worked through the massive record, trying to determine the truth about who had actually invented television. The answer, when it finally came in 1935, would shock the corporate world and vindicate a farm boy's impossible dream. The Patent Office Board of Appeals delivered its decision in 1935, and the words were unequivocal. Philo Taylor Farnsworth had priority. He had invented the image dissector. His patents were valid. RCA's interference claims were denied, but corporate giants don't accept defeat gracefully. RCA immediately appealed to the Court of Customs and Patent Appeals. More hearings, more testimony, more years of legal combat. They argued procedural errors, challenged witness credibility, demanded reconsideration of technical evidence. The appeals process consumed another year, generating thousands more pages of legal documentation. Through it all, Justin Tolman's sketch remained the unshakable foundation of Philo's case. A high school teacher's simple act of preserving a student's drawing had created evidence that no legal maneuvering could overcome. The date was certain. The signature was authentic. The technical content matched Philo's later work exactly. No amount of corporate legal power could change those facts. In October 1936, the appeals court affirmed the Patent Office decision. Philo Farnsworth had invented electronic television. The ruling was final. RCA had exhausted their appeals. After 6 years of litigation, spending hundreds of thousands on legal fees, deploying their best attorneys and technical experts, they had lost decisively. Now came the reckoning. Philo's fundamental image dissector patent would issue. Anyone manufacturing electronic television in America would need his permission. More importantly, they would need to pay him. David Sarnoff faced an unprecedented situation. RCA had built its empire on patent licensing. Other companies paid RCA royalties to use radio technology. But RCA had never paid significant royalties to independent inventors. They acquired patents through purchase or litigation, but they didn't accept ongoing royalty obligations to competitors. Television would be different. Sarnoff couldn't ignore Philo's patents. The court had validated them completely. He couldn't design around them. Electronic television fundamentally required the image dissector principle or similar approaches covered by Philo's patent portfolio. He couldn't wait them out. The patents had 17 years remaining, covering the crucial commercial development period. Negotiations began in 1937. RCA offered licensing terms. Philo's attorneys countered. Months of discussions followed, each side maneuvering for advantage. RCA wanted to minimize royalty rates, limit patent coverage, maintain maximum manufacturing freedom. Philo wanted fair compensation for inventions that would generate billions in television sales. The final agreement shocked the corporate world. RCA would pay Philo Farnsworth $1 million upfront plus ongoing royalties on every television manufactured using his patents. $1 million, roughly $20 million in current terms. The first time in RCA's history they had agreed to pay substantial royalties to an independent inventor. For Philo, it was vindication. Not just financial, though the money was certainly welcome after years of struggle, but recognition that his contribution was fundamental and irreplaceable. RCA, the world's most powerful electronics corporation, had been forced to acknowledge that a farm boy from Idaho had invented something they couldn't replicate or circumvent. But victory carried bitter undertones. The litigation had consumed 7 years. 7 years of legal fees, investor pressure, technical staff depletion, corporate warfare. 7 years that could have been spent improving television, developing new inventions, building manufacturing capability. Instead, he had spent them in depositions and courtrooms, defending what should have been obviously his. And RCA had gained something valuable despite losing in court. Those 7 years of litigation had delayed commercial television development, giving RCA time to build their own manufacturing infrastructure, establish NBC as the dominant broadcast network, position themselves as television's commercial leader. When television sales finally exploded, RCA would be ready with integrated systems, cameras, transmitters, receivers, broadcasting, facilities all working together seamlessly. Philo had patents and royalties. RCA had market dominance and public recognition. The question of who had truly won wouldn't be clear for years. More concerning was timing. His fundamental patents had been filed in 1927. Patent protection lasted 17 years from issue date, but issue dates were determined by patent office processing speed, not inventor timelines. Due to RCA's interference proceedings, his patents hadn't issued until the mid-1930s. They would expire in the early 1950s just as television sales were beginning to accelerate dramatically. This was the cruel mathematics of patent law. Years spent defending patents reduced years available for commercial exploitation. RCA's litigation strategy, though unsuccessful in invalidating his patents, had successfully consumed much of their valuable lifetime. Still, $1 million was substantial. Philo established Farnsworth Television and Radio Corporation, expanding operations beyond the cramped Green Street laboratory. He hired engineers to develop commercial television receivers. He designed manufacturing processes that could produce receivers affordably. He began negotiating with department stores and distributors to establish retail presence. But commercial success required more than good technology. It required brand recognition, advertising budgets, distribution networks, service infrastructure. RCA had all these advantages through their radio business. Farnsworth Television was starting from nothing, competing against a corporate giant with unlimited resources. The company produced beautiful television sets, The Farnsworth model BT50 was technically superior to comparable RCA receivers, sharper images, better sound quality, more reliable operation, but consumers had never heard of Farnsworth. They knew RCA from their radios. They watched NBC programs. When they thought television, they thought RCA. Philo poured money into advertising, trying to build brand awareness, but RCA's advertising budget dwarfed his entire revenue. They could afford full-page newspaper ads, radio commercials, celebrity endorsements. Farnsworth Television's modest print ads couldn't compete for consumer attention. Distribution was equally challenging. Major department stores wanted to stock RCA televisions the brand customers asked for. Shelf space was limited. Retailers saw no reason to carry unfamiliar brands when RCA provided everything they needed plus cooperative advertising support. Philo faced the inventor's eternal frustration. Technical superiority didn't guarantee commercial success. Patents provided legal protection but not market dominance. Recognition in courtrooms didn't translate to recognition in stores. He had won the legal battle, but was losing the commercial war. And something else was happening, something that would ultimately matter more than corporate competition. Events in Europe were deteriorating rapidly. Germany had invaded Poland. France and Britain had declared war. America was rearming, preparing for the conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. In April 1942, the War Production Board froze all civilian television manufacturing. Every electronics factory was converted to military production radar systems, communications equipment, electronic controls for weapon systems. Television development stopped completely. For RCA, this was merely an interruption. Their military contracts were enormous and profitable. They would resume television after the war with their manufacturing infrastructure intact, their brand recognition undiminished, their distribution networks ready to activate. For Philo, the timing was catastrophic. His patents were ticking toward expiration. Every year of frozen television sales was a year of lost royalties, lost market development, lost opportunity to establish his brand. When the war ended and television sales resumed, he would have perhaps 2 years of patent protection remaining, 2 years to recoup decades of investment and establish commercial viability. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. He had invented television. He had defended his patents successfully. He had forced RCA to acknowledge his priority. But through litigation delays and wartime interruption, the commercial value of those patents would largely evaporate before television became the mass-market phenomenon he had always known it would be. Still, there was work to do, important work. Philo turned his laboratory toward military applications. His image-to-sector principle could be adapted for infrared detection, for night vision systems, for targeting equipment. His electron multiplier technology enabled sensitive detectors for radar systems. His expertise in vacuum tube design was valuable for countless military applications. He developed over 100 patents during the war years, contributing genuinely to the Allied victory. But each patent application cost money. Each development project required staff and equipment. And unlike RCA with their massive military contracts, Farnsworth Television was a small company with limited resources. The financial pressure was relentless. Legal fees hadn't stopped defending his existing patents required ongoing vigilance. Manufacturing facilities needed maintenance even when idle. Engineers needed salaries. Investors wanted returns. The company was hemorrhaging money with no television revenue to offset expenses. Philo began drinking. Not heavily at first, just enough to quiet the anxiety that woke him at 3 a.m. calculating patent expiration dates. But gradually, the drinking increased. His health deteriorated. Elma worried constantly, watching her husband consumed by stress and disappointment. The war ended in August 1945. Television manufacturing could resume, but Philo's patents would expire in 1947. 2 years. Just 2 years to capitalize on 17 years of patent protection most of which had been consumed by litigation and war. In 1947, the dam broke. Television sales exploded from thousands to millions, almost overnight. Americans who had postponed purchases during the war rushed to buy sets. Manufacturers couldn't produce them fast enough. Retailers sold out inventory within days. Television transformed from exotic luxury to standard household appliance in barely 2 years, and RCA dominated completely. Their brand was synonymous with television. Their NBC network provided programming. Their manufacturing capacity produced sets at prices smaller companies couldn't match. They captured roughly 90% of the market. Philo's patents expired. His royalty stream ended. Farnsworth Television continued manufacturing receivers, but without patent protection to differentiate them, they competed purely on price and quality against corporations with vastly superior resources. The company struggled, then failed. By 1949, Farnsworth Television ceased operations. The inventor of television no longer had a television company. Philo had won every legal battle. The courts had recognized his invention completely. His name appeared on 300 patents covering fundamental aspects of electronic imaging. But in the history books being written, in the newspaper articles chronicling television's triumph, in the public's understanding of who created this revolutionary technology, his name was absent. David Sarnoff was celebrated as the father of television. RCA's corporate history claimed credit for developing electronic television. The farm boy from Idaho, who had actually invented it, was forgotten, his contribution erased as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. There is a particular cruelty in watching your invention transform the world while your name disappears from its history. Philo Farnsworth experienced this cruelty daily through the 1950s, as television became America's dominant medium, reshaping politics, entertainment, and culture, all without acknowledging the man who made it possible. By 1950, 10 million American homes had television sets. Families gathered in living rooms to watch Milton Berle, Lucille Ball, Ed Sullivan. Children rushed home from school for Howdy Doody. Americans planned their evenings around television schedules. The device had become more than entertainment. It was a social phenomenon, a cultural revolution, a window into a shared national experience. And almost none of those 10 million families had ever heard of Philo Farnsworth. The historical erasure was systematic and thorough. When newspapers published articles about television's history, they credited RCA's research laboratories. When magazines profiled television pioneers, they featured David Sarnoff and Vladimir Zworykin. When encyclopedias described television's invention, they mentioned Mechanical Systems by Baird and Jenkins, then jumped to RCA's electronic systems without naming individual inventors. Philo read these accounts with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. He had the patents, he had the court decisions, he had the technical publications proving his priority, but none of that mattered to public perception. History was being written by corporations with publicity departments, not by inventors with legal documents. He had moved his family to Maine, seeking quiet away from the industrial centers where his failure was most visible. He continued inventing his mind, couldn't stop seeing solutions to problems, improvements to existing technologies, entirely new approaches to technical challenges. But his company was gone. His capital was depleted. His patents on television had expired. The drinking worsened. Depression became a constant companion. Elma watched helplessly as her brilliant husband spiraled into darkness, tormented by the gap between his achievements and their recognition. He had given humanity television, and humanity had forgotten him. But his inventions hadn't disappeared. They had simply been absorbed into technologies that people used without understanding their origins. The image dissector principle evolved into charge-coupled devices, the sensors in every digital camera, every smartphone, every astronomical telescope. His electron multiplier enabled photomultiplier tubes used in medical imaging, scientific research, and industrial quality control. His fusion research, conducted in the 1930s when he was exploring alternatives to television, laid groundwork for controlled nuclear fusion experiments. 300 patents total. 300 solutions to problems that others hadn't solved. 300 contributions to human technology. But who knew? Who cared? Patents were legal documents, not monuments. They protected commercial rights during their 17-year lifetime, then entered public domain to be used freely by anyone. There was no mechanism for permanent attribution, no requirement that manufacturers acknowledge the inventors whose work made their products possible. By 1960, 90% of American homes had television. The penetration was faster than radio, faster than automobiles, faster than any previous technology. Television had become essential infrastructure for American life: news, entertainment, education, advertising, political campaigns. Everything flowed through television. RCA's dominance had diminished slightly. Other manufacturers, Zenith, Motorola, Admiral, captured market share. But RCA remained the industry leader, and David Sarnoff remained its public face. When he died in 1971, obituaries celebrated him as the father of American television, the visionary who brought electronic entertainment into every home. Philo read those obituaries. He was 64 years old, living in relative obscurity, his health broken by years of stress and alcohol. Sarnoff had died wealthy, celebrated, memorialized. Philo was alive but forgotten, his contribution to television reduced to footnotes in technical journals that nobody read. Yet something had shifted in his perspective. Perhaps it was age, or exhaustion, or simply acceptance of circumstances he couldn't change. He had lived to see television used for something beyond commercial programming. On July 20th, 1969, he had watched Neil Armstrong step onto the lunar surface, transmitted live to Earth through electronic television systems derived from his image dissector principle. 600 million people watched that broadcast. 600 million people saw humanity's first steps on another world, shared a moment of collective wonder, witnessed history through technology that Philo had invented in an Idaho potato field 47 years earlier. Elmer found him crying during the broadcast, not from bitterness or disappointment, but from something else. Pride, perhaps, or relief. Television had become more than he had imagined, not just entertainment, but a tool for expanding human experience, for sharing discoveries, for connecting people across vast distances in moments of significance. This makes it all worthwhile, he told her. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps in that moment, watching Armstrong's grainy image transmitted from the moon, he found peace with his legacy. Not the legacy of wealth or fame or public recognition, but the legacy of creating something that served humanity's highest aspirations. He died on March 11th, 1971, 4 months before Sarnoff. The obituaries were brief. Some newspapers didn't mention him at all. Those that did generally described him as an early television inventor, without explaining that early meant first, that inventor meant the inventor, that his contribution was fundamental rather than incremental. His grave marker in Salt Lake City bore his name and dates. No mention of television, no acknowledgement of his 300 patents. Just Philo Farnsworth, 1906 to 1971, as if he had been an ordinary man who lived an ordinary life. But his electrons still paint pictures. Every television, every computer monitor, every smartphone screen, every digital camera, all descendants of principles he discovered. The image dissector evolved into technologies he never imagined, solving problems he never anticipated, serving purposes beyond his conception. The 202 Green Street laboratory, where he first transmitted television images, has been demolished. A parking structure occupies the site now. A small plaque on a nearby building notes that Philo Farnsworth invented electronic television in this location. offering passers-by a whisper of recognition for the farm boy whose electrons painted humanity's shared dreams. History has begun correcting its omissions. Technical historians acknowledge his primacy. Patent scholars study his litigation against RCA as a David versus Goliath tale. Documentary films have explored his life and contributions. Slowly, grudgingly, the record is being amended. But for Philo himself, that vindication came too late. He died forgotten, his name unknown to the millions who used his invention daily, his contribution erased from the history he had created. The courts had recognized his genius. The patents had validated his priority. But public memory had failed him completely, and perhaps that failure contains a lesson about innovation itself. Technical achievement and public recognition follow different timelines, driven by different forces. Inventors create the future, but corporations and historians decide how that future is remembered. Patents expire, but influence persists. Names are forgotten, but contributions endure. Philo Farnsworth invented television. The courts confirmed it. The patents proved it. The technology demonstrates it. Everything else, the fame, the fortune, the recognition, was noise surrounding that fundamental truth. Consider how ideas propagate through time. A seed falls from a tree, germinates in soil, grows into a forest that spreads across landscapes the original tree never touched. Scientific principles work similarly. A discovery made for one purpose evolves into applications its inventor never imagined, solving problems that didn't exist when the original patent was filed. Philo Farnsworth's image dissector was designed for television, but the principle it embodied, converting light directly into electrical signals through photoelectric emission, was far more fundamental than any single application. He had discovered how to make electrons carry visual information, and that discovery would revolutionize fields he never contemplated. In 1969, researchers at Bell Laboratories invented the charge-coupled device. The CCD was essentially a modern descendant of Farnsworth's image dissector, using semiconductor technology instead of vacuum tubes, but based on the same fundamental principle. Convert photons into electrons, store those electrons in an organized pattern, then read them out sequentially to create an image. CCDs transformed astronomy. Telescopes could suddenly capture images thousands of times more sensitive than photographic film. Distant galaxies became visible. Faint stars revealed their spectra. The Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990, used CCD sensors derived from Farnsworth's principles to photograph the universe's deep structure, revealing galaxies 13 billion light-years away, images of the universe when it was barely 700 million years old. Every digital camera contains Farnsworth's legacy. Every smartphone captures images using sensors based on photoelectric principles he discovered. When tourists photograph landmarks, when scientists document experiments, when journalists capture breaking news, they're using technology descended from sketches made on an Idaho blackboard in 1922. The electron multiplier he invented in the 1930s found applications everywhere. Medical imaging devices use photomultiplier tubes based on his cascade emission principle. Mass spectrometers in chemistry labs use electron multipliers to detect individual ions. Particle physics experiments use them to detect radiation. Nuclear monitoring equipment uses them to measure radioactivity. Night vision systems derive from his infrared work during World War II. Military forces conduct operations in complete darkness, using equipment that converts invisible infrared light into visible images. Police helicopters search for suspects using thermal imaging. Firefighters navigate smoke-filled buildings using infrared cameras, all descendants of Farnsworth's wartime developments. His fusion research produced the first sustained nuclear fusion reaction in 1965, the fusor, a device that used electric fields to accelerate ions to fusion energies. Commercial fusers now serve as neutron sources for scientific research, medical isotope production, and materials analysis. While they don't generate net energy, they demonstrate that independent inventors could still make fundamental contributions to fields dominated by government laboratories with billion-dollar budgets. Even his failed commercial ventures produced valuable patents. The Farnsworth Television and Radio Corporation might have collapsed financially, but its patent portfolio covered innovations in radio receivers, radar systems, electronic controls, and vacuum tube designs that influenced countless products. Other manufacturers licensed these patents, built products incorporating his ideas, generated profits from his inventions, even though his company couldn't. This is the hidden legacy of inventors, not just the products they create, but the knowledge they contribute to humanity's collective understanding. Philo's 300 patents represent 300 problems solved, 300 techniques developed, 300 insights that others could build upon. Even if his name was forgotten, his contributions remained embedded in technology's evolution. By 2000, approximately 2 billion television sets existed worldwide. Add computer monitors, smartphone screens, digital cameras, medical imaging devices, scientific instruments, and the number of devices using Farnsworth-derived principles exceeded 5 billion. 5 billion pieces of equipment, used by billions of people, all incorporating knowledge that began with a 14-year-old boy seeing television in potato field furrows. The economic value was incalculable. Television advertising became a trillion-dollar industry. Consumer electronics generated hundreds of billions annually. Scientific instruments enabled discoveries worth untold billions in medical treatments, industrial processes, and technological innovations. And none of it would exist without the foundational work of converting light to electrons and back again. Yet Philo received virtually nothing from this vast wealth. His patents expired in the 1940s. His company failed in the 1950s. The $1 million from RCA, substantial in 1937, was consumed by legal fees, manufacturing costs, and wartime survival. He died with modest savings, having invented technologies worth trillions, but captured almost none of that value himself. This disconnection between invention and reward is capitalism's recurring tragedy. Inventors create value, but capitalists capture it. Patents provide temporary monopolies, but 17 years is insufficient for transformative technologies that take decades to reach full commercial potential. By the time television became truly profitable, Philo's patents had expired and his contribution was forgotten. Some argue this is necessary and proper. Patents grant temporary exclusivity to encourage innovation, then release inventions to public domain where everyone can benefit. Society gains enormously from inventors' work, even if inventors themselves don't capture proportional wealth. The knowledge becomes humanity's shared inheritance, available for anyone to improve upon. But there's something unsatisfying about a system where the inventor of television dies nearly forgotten, while corporations that manufactured his invention became some of the 20th century's wealthiest enterprises, where David Sarnoff was celebrated as a visionary leader, while Philo Farnsworth was remembered, if at all, as an early television inventor, without clarifying that early meant first and inventor meant the inventor. Historical correction has been slow but persistent. In 1984, a statue of Philo Farnsworth was placed in the United States Capitol's National Statuary Hall, representing Utah. The inscription reads, "Father of Television." It took 13 years after his death, but official recognition finally came. In 1990, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. In 2003, the Television Academy honored him posthumously. Documentary films told his story. Books chronicled his battle against RCA. Technical historians acknowledged his fundamental contributions. The 202 Green Street location, though demolished, now bears proper markers. San Francisco designated it a historic landmark. Plaques explain that electronic television was invented there, that Philo Farnsworth transmitted the first all-electronic images on September 7, 1927. His high school in Rigby, Idaho, now celebrates its famous student. A museum displays his early work, including reproductions of the blackboard sketch that defeated RCA in court. Students learn that a local farm boy invented television, that genius can emerge anywhere, that formal credentials aren't prerequisites for revolutionary innovation. These recognitions matter. Not to Philo, he died before most of them occurred, but to history's integrity. The record should reflect reality. Television wasn't invented by corporate laboratories or research teams. It was invented by a 14-year-old farm boy who saw the future in potato fields and spent his life making that vision real. And his inventions continue evolving. Modern CMOS image sensors, successors to CCDs, power virtually every camera and smartphone. They're faster, cheaper, more energy efficient than earlier technologies, but they still operate on Farnsworth's fundamental principle: convert photons to electrons, organize those electrons spatially, read them out to create images. Virtual reality headsets use tiny high-resolution displays descended from his television work. Augmented reality glasses overlay computer-generated images on reality using sensors and displays, all based on photoelectric principles he pioneered. The metaverse, if it ever fully materializes, will rely on imaging technologies derived from concepts sketched on a blackboard in 1922. Medical endoscopes transmit images from inside human bodies using fiber optics and image sensors. Surgical robots provide surgeons with high-definition views of microscopic structures. Diagnostic imaging systems reveal diseases at cellular levels. All possible because Philo figured out how to make electrons paint pictures. Space exploration depends on imaging technologies descended from his work. Mars rovers photograph alien landscapes. Orbital telescopes study distant exoplanets. Deep space probes send back images from the solar system's edge. Humanity's reach beyond Earth is enabled by technology invented to transmit images across living rooms. The seeds he planted have become forests. His ideas have propagated through decades of refinement, spreading into applications he never anticipated. The image dissector tube is obsolete, but the principles it embodied are more relevant than ever. Semiconductor physics has replaced vacuum tube electronics, but photoelectric conversion remains fundamental. This is how innovation works. Individual inventions matter less than the knowledge they represent. Philo's specific devices have been superseded by better implementations, but his insights about how to convert light to electrical signals and back remain core to modern technology. He didn't just invent television, he invented the conceptual framework for electronic imaging that continues evolving today. And perhaps that's the legacy that matters most. Not wealth or fame or public recognition, but contribution to humanity's expanding capabilities. Philo Farnsworth made the 21st century possible. The information age, the digital revolution, the global communications network, all built on foundations he laid while ploughing potato fields and sketching impossible dreams on blackboards. His electrons still paint our pictures. Every screen we touch, every image we capture, every video we share, all made possible by a farm boy who saw the future and spent his life making it real. In 1957, a curious thing happened on national television. The game show I've Got a Secret featured celebrity panelists who tried to guess contestants' secrets through yes or no questions. That evening's guest was a modest, soft-spoken man in his 50s who walked onto the stage to polite applause. The panelists Jane Meadows, Henry Morgan, Betsy Palmer, and Bess Meyerson began their questions. Is your secret something you did? Yes. Does it involve your work? Yes. Is it something most people would recognize? The contestant hesitated. In a way, yes. They continued guessing. An inventor of some kind? Yes. Something electrical? Yes. Something to do with entertainment? Possibly. The questions went on, but nobody guessed. Finally, host Gary Moore revealed the secret. This gentleman invented the television set. The audience applauded warmly. The panelists looked surprised. Television's inventor was sitting right there, on a television show, and none of them had recognized him. Philo Farnsworth smiled shyly, collected his modest prize money, and left the stage. It was a perfect crystallization of his invisibility. He had invented the device that everyone in the studio used daily, that millions of Americans watched every evening, that had transformed entertainment and culture. But his name was unknown. His face was unfamiliar. His contribution had been so thoroughly erased from public memory that celebrity panelists, whose careers depended on television, couldn't identify the man who made it possible. Elma was with him that evening. She watched her husband maintain composure through the segment, smiling graciously despite the painful irony. Later, she would recall his mixed emotions, his pleasure at some recognition, however modest, combined with sadness that this was the extent of public acknowledgement for inventing television. But something had changed in Philo by then. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the moon landing, still 12 years in the future but already being planned. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion with bitterness. He had made his peace, as much as anyone can, with the disconnect between achievement and recognition. He told Elma something profound in those later years. He had lived to see television used for education, for cultural exchange, for shared human experiences that transcended commercial entertainment. The moon landing, especially, gave him satisfaction. 600 million people watching humanity's first steps on another world that was television's highest purpose realized. Yes, he had been cheated of wealth. Yes, he had been erased from history. Yes, corporations had stolen credit for his inventions. But the technology itself existed. It worked. It served humanity. And perhaps that was what mattered most. Consider what television achieved. Beyond entertainment, civil rights protesters broadcast their struggle into American living rooms, making distant injustices immediate and personal. Presidential debates reached millions, transforming political campaigns. Disasters were witnessed in real time, mobilizing humanitarian responses. Scientific documentaries brought natural wonders into homes worldwide. Educational programming taught children in remote areas. Cultural performances reached audiences who would never see them live. Television connected humanity in unprecedented ways. It created shared experiences across vast distances. It made the world smaller, more comprehensible, more immediate. And Philo had made that possible by seeing electrons painting pictures in potato field furrows. His later years were quiet. He moved frequently, never quite settling, never quite comfortable with fame or its absence. He continued inventing almost compulsively. His mind never stopped seeing solutions, improvements, possibilities. But the fire that drove him to invent television had cooled to embers. He was tired. When he died in March 1971, he left behind Elma, 4 sons, numerous grandchildren, 300 patents, and a legacy that the world was only beginning to understand. The obituaries were inadequate, but Elma knew the truth. She had been there from the beginning, had seen his sketches, had witnessed his struggles, had watched him change the world despite every obstacle. She became his advocate in death, ensuring his story wasn't completely forgotten. She gave interviews, provided photographs, shared documentation. When historians began researching television's invention, she made materials available. When documentary filmmakers needed information, she participated. The historical record owes much to her determination that her husband's contribution not disappear entirely. Today, 2 billion television sets operate worldwide. Add computers, smartphones, tablets, and the number exceeds 5 billion devices using display technologies descended from Farnsworth's work. Every second, countless people look at screens showing images created by electrons painting pictures exactly as Philo envisioned in 1922. The economic impact is staggering. Global television advertising exceeds $600 billion annually. Consumer electronics manufacturing generates over $1 trillion. Entertainment industries built on television reach billions of viewers. And the foundation for all of it, the fundamental technology that makes electronic imaging possible, was invented by a farm boy who never graduated from college. His statue stands in the Capitol, representing Utah among America's most honored citizens. His name appears in the National Inventors Hall of Fame, alongside Edison, Tesla, and the Wright brothers. Documentary films tell his story to new generations. Students learn his name in science classes when studying photoelectric effects and cathode ray tubes. But most people still don't know who invented television. Ask random Americans, and they'll guess Edison or RCA, or simply say they don't know. The connection between Philo Farnsworth and the screens they stare at for hours daily remains invisible to most. Perhaps that's acceptable. Inventors don't create technologies for recognition. They create them because they see possibilities that others miss, because they can't not create, because their minds compel them toward solutions. Recognition is pleasant but peripheral. The technology itself is what matters, and Philo's technology endures. Every image sensor captures light using photoelectric principles he explored. Every display shows images using scanning techniques he developed. Every video call, every photograph, every movie, every television show, all made possible by work that began with a 14-year-old seeing patterns in plowed fields. The 202 Green Street Laboratory is gone, replaced by parking, structures, and modern buildings. But markers indicate where television was born. Visitors can stand on the spot where electrons first painted pictures, where a 21-year-old inventor and his small team achieved what corporate laboratories thought impossible. In Rigby, Idaho, the fields where Philo saw his vision still grow potatoes. Farmers still plow parallel furrows, probably never thinking about television, never knowing that their ordinary agricultural work inspired one of history's most transformative inventions. The landscape is unchanged, but what Philo saw there changed everything. His electrons still paint our world. They show us Mars landscapes and deep space galaxies. They transmit medical procedures to surgeons worldwide. They connect families across continents. They educate, entertain, inform, and inspire billions of people who will never know his name. And perhaps there's something appropriate about that anonymity. Philo didn't invent television for glory. He invented it because he saw how it could work and couldn't rest until he made it real. The invention was its own reward. The technology serving humanity was validation enough. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but most giants remain nameless. The inventors, the innovators, the dreamers who saw possibilities and made them real, their names fade while their contributions endure. Philo Farnsworth joins that company of forgotten revolutionaries whose work changed everything, but whose recognition was limited or delayed or denied. But the light persists. Every glowing screen is a monument to his vision. Every electronic image is a reminder that 14-year-olds in potato fields can see the future. Every technological marvel built on his foundations proves that genius can emerge anywhere, that formal credentials don't determine innovation, that one person with a clear vision can change the world. Philo Taylor Farnsworth, 1906 to 1971, inventor of electronic television. Holder of 300 patents, the farm boy whose electrons painted humanity's shared dreams. The light he created still illuminates our world, and that light will never dim.